Good morning. We're very pleased to be here this morning on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Aujourd'hui, le Parlement du Canada va commencer le finalement débat pour l'établissement d'un plan d'action pour la prévention du suicide. C'est nécessaire pour le gouvernement du Canada de jouer un rôle positif, de mettre en place les ressources et un plan, de travailler avec les provinces, les territoires, les communautés autochtones pour garantir les réponses des crises de suicide. Canada est le seul pays le G7 sans un plan de répondre aux crises de suicide. Ce n'est pas acceptable. This morning, I'm thinking of a hotel room in Thunder Bay where I was called when I was last in the city at around 11 o'clock at night to go visit a family with my provincial colleague Saul Mamakwa, and we came up to the third floor, and down the entire length of the hallway were families and children coming to pay their respects to a mother and father of a 14-year-old girl who just died in Thunder Bay. And as we had to walk the long line and offer our condolences, we went from the cousins to the neighbors, to the students, to the family members, to the sisters, to the brothers, and then into that little room where the parents sat and wept. And the only thing they said to me was, "We have lost so many in our family." This is the face of suicide in this nation. It is a shockwave of grief that doesn't just affect the family, it affects entire communities. It has the horrific impacts of creating clusters and echoes of other grief and other actions of suicide. And in my work as a Member of Parliament in the Timmins-James Bay Treaty 9 region, we have seen suicide after suicide. We have seen coroner's reports. We have had the Council of the Mushkegowuk Cree establish an inquiry, and they couldn't get any government partners to come to the table to look at why so many young people in a country as rich as Canada were killing themselves. And as I was talking with the Mushkegowuk Council at the time, Jack Hicks approached me and said, "Why is there no national suicide plan? Why do we not work at the federal level to do this?" So today, this is our final opportunity to bring to this Parliament a national suicide prevention strategy, to call on members of Parliament from all parties to do the right thing, because suicide is not political. It cuts across the economic boundaries, it cuts across cultural boundaries, it cuts across the political dimensions of our nation. It affects every community. We all have a role to play. We look at Quebec, which established a suicide prevention plan and dropped the death rates by 50%. If we put the resources in place to start collecting the data, to start identifying the trigger mechanisms, the risk factors, to start working on national training standards, to ensure that when we do have suicide prevention strategies, that they are culturally appropriate, that they speak to people in a cultural way that will work with them, we can start to make a real change. So we are calling on the Government of Canada, we're calling on every single Member of Parliament to work with us, to do the right thing, and implement Motion 174 to establish a National Suicide Action Plan. I'll turn it over to Don Davies, our health critic.
Thank you, Charlie. As health critic for the New Democratic Party of Canada, I'm pleased to support the evidence-based approach to suicide prevention set out in Motion M-174, and I want to particularly thank my colleague Charlie Angus, the member for Timmins-James Bay, for spearheading what I think is one of the most critical initiatives in health that this country is seeing and that is desperately needed. Research has shown that mental illness is the most important risk factor for suicide, and that more than 90% of people who commit suicide suffer from a mental illness or substance use disorder. The numbers are really quite shocking. Suicide is second only to accidents as the leading cause of death for young people in Canada. Overall, suicide is the 9th leading cause of death in Canada. On average, 10 people die every single day in this country from suicide. More than 5,800 children and youth have died by suicide during the past 13 years across Canada, some as young as 8 years old. But according to the Public Health Agency of Canada, for every suicide death, there are 5 self-inflicted injury hospitalizations and 25 to 30 suicide attempts. And this problem is staying stable, and in some provinces we're seeing increases in rates. While the federal government has recently made some targeted investments in mental health, there is still a long way to go before mental health care is funded on par with physical health care in Canada and in proportion to the burden of illness. Canada currently spends just 7 cents out of every public health care dollar on mental health, far below the 10 to 11% spent in countries such as New Zealand and the UK. In fact, Canada's relatively small investment in mental health care puts us near the back of the pack among developed countries. This chronic underfunding means that far too many Canadians cannot access the right combination of services, treatments, and supports when and where they need them. Moreover, as important as mental health services are for suicide prevention, they alone are not sufficient. We need a comprehensive suicide prevention action plan like this motion calls for, because no single determinant, including mental illness, is enough on its own to cause a suicide. Indeed, suicide typically results from the interaction of many risk factors. For example, as part of our current study at the Health Committee on LGBTQ2+ health, the Standing Committee on Health recently learned that trans youth in Canada who don't have family support and have experienced other forms of discrimination have a 72% chance of making a suicide attempt. However, trans youth with strong family support and who experience no other forms of discrimination have just a 7% chance. Therefore, in addition to improving access to mental health services, we must address the social determinants of health that put certain populations at greater risk of suicide. These would include addressing discrimination, racism, intergenerational trauma, and inequalities anchored in colonial policies. Reducing income inequality and poverty by making financial, labor, and housing markets more inclusive, and fostering closer cultural and community ties. Canada's New Democrats believe that the federal government must play a leadership role in these efforts. So I therefore call on all members of Parliament from all parties to support M-174 and the work of my colleague Charlie Angus and the immediate implementation of a national suicide prevention action plan. We need it to save lives. It's time to transform our healthcare system to address this vital healthcare need. Thank you.
Good morning and thank you. Suicide is an incredibly difficult social question, but a lot more progress has been made globally on suicide prevention than a lot of people realize. The World Health Organization calls suicide a largely preventable public health problem. Nobody's claiming that we can eliminate suicide altogether. No society, past or present, has ever done that. But there are examples around the world of countries or regions that have taken suicide prevention seriously and significantly reduced the rate of death by suicide. Canada is a very strange country in this respect. We're a full part of the World Health Organization. We've signed on to an international commitment to lower our suicide rate significantly by 2030, but we're not taking any serious steps to achieve that goal. I'm not sure, as Charlie mentioned, Canada is one of the few developed countries not to have a national strategy for suicide prevention. And I'm not sure how many WHO recommendations the Government of Canada ignores, but this is one of them. Within Canada, we have
So Canada has no national strategy, and there are provinces, most provinces have no national strategy, and as Charlie pointed out, things are not getting better necessarily in those areas. But when you go to international gatherings on suicide prevention, one of the places people talk the most about is Quebec. So in 1998, they launched a provincial strategy. A decade later, they reduced their overall rate by 30% and their youth rate by 50%. Hundreds of Quebec families each year do not lose a loved one to suicide because of the action that the provincial government has taken. We need to see the same commitment and action at the national level. Within Canada, we also have the crisis of military suicides. The government's response has been to put in place an evidence-informed military suicide prevention strategy. Exactly what the situation requires, but it's only for the military. Also within Canada, we have the Indigenous question. Many Indigenous parts of the country do not have an elevated rates of suicide, but all the communities in Canada with elevated rates are Indigenous communities. There is no targeted action for those communities. There may be local targeted action, but not the federal government, other than sending in crisis workers. There's no plan to address the issue. But there can be. This issue has been raised, and Inuit leaders have, first with the Nunavut Suicide Prevention Strategy and the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy, which was just given additional funding in the most recent budget, indicating that the federal government takes it seriously. Why do we have these targeted efforts and not a national effort as well? I just want to leave you with two quotes. This issue was discussed in the House of Commons in 2011, and two quotes from that time, one by, at the time, a young backbench MP from Quebec, now the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. He said, "We must take action because we can. We need to have a national suicide strategy to reach people in need in every sector of our society. We must put our efforts into improving life for our citizens. This is what we on this side of the House sincerely believe in, and we hope the government will act accordingly." Carolyn Bennett, now Minister, said at the time, "We want a real strategy, and that means what, when, and how. We want it based in evidence, and we want it funded properly. This means that there has to be an ability to use the research and knowledge and translate that into effective policies, effective programs and practices. It means ongoing applied research that takes us back to better research that can really identify best practice. Then we have to have the nerve to put it in place." Precisely. And I hope that all members of the House vote in that spirit this afternoon. Thank you, Charlie, for your leadership on it.
Thank you.